Okay, we'll get started. Just a reminder, we have a quiz in lab on Wednesday. Just like our same other ones, it's cumulative, so it includes any of the information we've talked about so far with priority given to the new information since quiz 3. So yeah, hopefully that we're all used to this system by now and that won't be a problem. But today we're going to talk about behavior problems that actually arise in poultry production systems and what we can do about solving some of these, kind of in the face of their intricacies and complexities that arise with producers kind of having to balance all the different problems that they have to deal with. So welfare problems, as well as the fact that they just don't have infinite resources and money to build enormous structures. At some point, they need to be practical. So how can we deal with some of these issues from a practical and a welfare standpoint? So fairly obviously, if we just look at this photograph of laying hens in battery cages, I mean, one of the things that's going to come up over and over again as we see photos of these types of systems throughout this lecture is that there's this overcrowding problem. So overcrowding and limiting of space limits the behaviors that an animal can express. I don't know why my slides are not advancing. There we go. Okay, so just kind of some general statistics, poultry production in the US, and these are a little bit old at this point. I have some updated ones in the next slide. So poultry production and egg production is still a huge business in the US. So even though it's second to cattle and beef, it still accounts for an enormous amount of dollars in the US, so 48 billion. And I know this statistic is particularly old, but I left it in here anyways because, and I've never been able to find an updated version of this, but at least until 2001, the liquid egg was becoming more and more popular. So I'm not quite sure what that's really used for, and if that trend has continued or not, if we consume more liquid eggs than we used to. But of course, manufacturing that goes along with this and technology has also been changing. And then as we continue further in time, so there's even more, so the expected increase has continued, and this is through 2019 as poultry, the US has been a leader in producing poultry, and it's the second largest exporter. And actually, I looked at some of the more recent information out there, and I think we're actually losing now. So as of 2021, countries like China and Malaysia in particular, Malaysia produces a huge amount of poultry. The Netherlands was #1 as far as exporting eggs. So I don't think we export as many eggs as maybe we used to compared to these other countries. But we're still a huge producer of poultry, and other countries that are catching up to us, such as more countries that are still developing right now, like Malaysia and China, are using some of these technologies or some of these, systems to house their laying hens. So even if things like we're going to talk about battery cages, even though those have been banned in the EU, there are still many, many countries out there that are using these types of cages. So let's look at the two basic different types of poultry production, raising chickens for meat versus raising chickens for eggs. And problems arise from both of these systems due to these agonistic social interactions. But in battery cages, it's a little bit worse because they're confined even more. So broilers, even though they can move around a bit more, they still have about 0.8 of a square foot per bird to move around in. These housing systems can hold up to 20,000 birds, and they're slaughtered much earlier than laying hens. But if we compare this to laying hens, so these battery cages, they house from 3 to 8 hens together. And this leaves each hen about the size of an A4 piece of paper. So the paper you're hopefully staring at right now, taking notes on, that's about the amount of space that these hens have to move around. So very, very little. And obviously that's, that has to be quite unpleasant to live your life, which is they lay for approximately 12 months, spend a whole year in that kind of scenario. So even though this has been discussed as a welfare concern, the vast majority of egg-laying hens in the United States are actually still confined in battery cages. And this is actually a current statistic from the Humane Society as of this year. And many people have noted this. And if we remember our our good old friend Konrad Lorenz, so he was the Nobel laureate who discovered imprinting in ducks and geese. He most certainly had something to say about the way that chickens are raised. And basically, I'll let you read his quote up here, but basically that it's, if you raise laying hens in this scenario, you're basically torturing them. And his main concern was that they weren't able to freely express this laying behavior. So a chicken will try to search for cover in order to lay eggs, and she'll try and get down beneath her cage mates to find this, but there really isn't any cover in this scenario. So we'll talk about 3 major concerns that arise in these systems, and they are, in this order: battery cages, cannibalism, and debeaking, and they're all interrelated and mostly stem from this, the lack of space and overcrowding that are present in these battery cage systems. So let's talk a little bit more about battery cages. So we know from other previous research and just kind of looking at this intuitively that common behaviors in chickens are highly restricted or totally prevented in these cages. The reason they're called battery cages is because they're lined up like cells of a battery. So that reminded somebody of a battery at some point. And if we remember our 5 freedoms, these are going to come up here, especially number 4, freedom to express normal behavior. And also number 3, once they start actually pecking at each other so much that they actually kill each other, obviously that's painful, and a bird would not be free from pain, injury, or disease if it's in a scenario where its cage mates actually peck it to death. So if we want to talk about normal behavior and what we're preventing chickens from actually doing, let's just take a quick look at what jungle fowl would be doing in nature if these were wild birds. So Gallus gallus, the red jungle fowl, is from Southeast Asia, and they usually live in small mixed-sex flocks during the non-breeding season. And of course, they have this well-established pecking order, which is where we get the term literally pecking order from chickens, because they establish a linear dominance hierarchy, and they're quite violent about it. So during the breeding season, then, a dominant cock will maintain a territory with about 3 to 5 females. So they like to be more spaced out. And then from this, all the young disperse. So they're not in really related groups of individuals. They're small groups. They have a lot of space. They most certainly develop this pecking order, and they do so quite violently. And there's very likely a genetic component to dominance. So very often the top-ranking roosters, who are more likely to be dominant than the low-ranking ones, their offspring follow this pattern. So there's definitely a genetic component to these behaviors. So that's going to be important later on in this lecture, understanding that these behaviors are heritable. Okay, so what if some people or some, really countries putting out legislation, what have they done about this? So in the European Union, battery cages have been banned since 2012, and they started implementing a new enriched cage design that includes these following things. So areas that allow laying hens to express more of this normal behavior and avoid conspecifics crawling all over on top of them. So things like an enriched cage will have areas where there's a nesting area, so they can actually build a nest and lay and express those particular behaviors. They have perches that run along parts of the cage, areas where they can scratch and stretch, so they can actually stretch out their wings and have more room to move. So that's all well and good, but not all countries have banned battery cages. So even though we have cage-free areas in the US, only a few states have actually banned them. I think California and Oregon. Last I heard, there was a moratorium on banning battery cages in Ohio. I'm not quite sure what's happened with that. So not all of the US has banned battery cages. And even countries like Australia, they still use battery cages. And then countries that are, developing large poultry industries, such as Pakistan and Malaysia. I'm not exactly where they are with this, but I have a feeling they have not banned battery cages either. So really the EU is leading this. But nonetheless, even in cage-free areas, you still have these overcrowding problems. So it is most certainly better because they do have these areas to go to and lay and scratch and stretch their wings out. But obviously they're still right on top of each other, and there's going to be a lot of potentially violent interactions. And this leads us to the second problem. So I'll pause for questions really quick. Are there any so far?
I just had a clarifying question. So are battery cages just like the small
Sorry, you cut out, Alethea. Can you repeat?
cages? Sorry. Just to clarify, the battery cages are just like the small wired cages that they're like exclusive to or stuck into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're they're square rectangle cages, and they house 3 to 8 chickens, and it makes the eggs easier to collect.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so within these cages, very often these violent interactions, they turn into individuals in a cage pecking repeatedly at maybe one or several individuals, so much to where they actually inflict these horrible wounds and actually end up killing. They kill a lot of birds through what we're going to call cannibalism. So this is really defined as it involves this beak-inflicted injury, and they do often consume the blood and other tissues of their cage mates. Whether it's but just pecking, whether they're consuming it or not, would it also inflict this same amount of damage. So this some evidence has actually suggested that it's a learned behavior from observing other birds engage in the same behavior. I'm sure that contributes. I would also argue that this is there's some innate piece of this, such as misdirected behavior, which actually is going to come up down here. So if the most compelling hypothesis actually relates this behavior to misdirected foraging behavior, and my guess is this is a combination of learning and innate behavior. They're just not allowed to express it. They don't have a place to, forage and scratch, so they need to dissipate some behavioral energy, and they end up doing this to their cage mates. But quite obviously, this is a very serious both welfare and economic problem, because if you are losing birds to these injuries, well, that's not a nice way to die. So it's a welfare concern, and also you're losing money if you're losing birds because they're essentially killing each other. So the most common technique to combat this is to trim their beaks. So this is that third welfare concerns, so debeaking. And these are how these three are all interrelated. So beak trimming is performed on chicks with a heat blade without any anesthetic. And the EU actually also banned debeaking, but there's some evidence that maybe it's actually going to increase cannibalism. So beak trimming, as you can imagine, this tissue that's vascularized, if you take off the front of that beak with this heat gun, it's very, very likely going to cause chronic pain and most certainly causes acute pain, especially if you have to do it multiple times. So one of the hypotheses that people think maybe debeaking works to prevent cannibalism is simply because pecking becomes really painful. So if you damage their beak, yes, you are blunting the tip of their beak, but maybe they also don't do it just because it hurts. So these are the three, and there are other welfare concerns, but these really are the three main welfare concerns in poultry production, and they are related to the use of battery cages. So these are, so as well as the space, these welfare concerns, they're an outcome of these agonistic social interactions that come up when you confine birds in a very, very small space. And, of course, we have to, understand a little bit where the producer is coming from. So again, they don't have infinite resources. They still, they still need to actually produce food for people and do so for profit. And it wouldn't help anybody or the animal if they don't have enough money to meet any kind of welfare concerns. So producers are juggling a lot, and they need to satisfy people's wishes and expectations, and also produce a product in an economically feasible way so that they can run a business. So them going under also isn't going to help anybody. So we do want to think about welfare concerns and think about enrichment, but what else can we do in order to help producers come up with economical solutions to some of these welfare problems? So laying hens, we know that they're housed in these cages where they're in very, very close quarters. And so what producers would like to see would be increased survivability. So stop this cannibalism if it's actually causing mortality. So increase survivability, increase the condition of your animals. So increase their egg weight. If they're in better condition, they're very likely going to put more resources into eggs. Increase the number of eggs each hen can lay per day. Increase the egg, the age at the first time a hen lays an egg, and then do so in some kind of economical way. Come up with these solutions that can, be sustainable monetarily, that is. So a few things that have been tried. So I have these coded in red and green here. So what are some of these solutions? So beak trimming is an attempted solution to deal with cannibalism, and then that itself is a welfare concern. So, if we can get away from doing that, that would definitely be a really good thing. That doesn't seem like a very pleasant thing to do to an animal. Another tactic that's been employed has been to raise chickens in very dim light. So if you decrease the light, you simply decrease the amount of activity. And this seems to decrease the aggressive interactions. Although not as painful as maybe beak trimming, this is still not, keeping animals in the dark. That it's only so effective, and that's also doesn't seem that nice either to just mess with their circadian rhythms and keep them all in the dark so they don't move around as much. Environmental enrichment, that's a really great idea, and there's been improvement in chicken or welfare in poultry due to these enrichments. But it can be really expensive if you have to overhaul your entire production system. And not everybody's willing to do that for the price that they can charge for their eggs. So obviously this is an economic maybe issue. So what can we do? A cheap way to maybe combat this is to come up with some kind of selective breeding design. So we're going to work here and talk about how can we select for maybe nicer chickens. And once we go down this road, some of the problems that come up here, which are quite fascinating. So problems with these breeding programs is that you start selecting for increased egg production and you get more aggressive individuals. If you select for earlier age at first egg, you also get more aggressive individuals. So you select for increased individual production and you actually decrease the overall mean production of your entire flock. So that sounds really bad. That sounds really bad both on the welfare and the economic standpoint. So individual breeding programs in poultry have really failed. So why does this happen? If you select for one trait and you get a decrease in another trait, what's going on? So what do we remember from our genetics lectures? What is this called? You can either say the word or describe what's happening.
Isn't it a trade-off?
It's a trade-off between between two traits. And so sure, what is the genetic mechanism that is underlying this trade-off?
Is it polygenic or polygenic inheritance?
It's not polygenic, although I would agree with you that these traits are very likely polygenic. So polygenic means that a trait that is controlled by many genes. And so even though this is happening to many genes all at once, how might these genes be, or how might these genes be controlling maybe two traits at once? What do we call that?
Is it a negative genetic correlation?
It is a negative genetic correlation. That is absolutely what we're seeing. So let's write some of this down. I have a drawing tablet here today. So why does this happen? Let's say we observe trade-off between, that shorthand for between, egg production and aggression. Sorry, I haven't written on this tablet in a while. It's a little bit hard to write on. And we also observe a negative genetic correlation. So this is due to what genetic mechanism? What do you call it when one gene controls more than one trait?
Pleiotropy?
Yep. Yeah, so there's very likely these same genes that are involved in individuals being highly aggressive and, becoming sexually mature earlier. So really, pleiotropy means one gene controls two traits. And in this case, the pleiotropy is antagonistic. So antagonistic pleiotropy is why we see negative genetic correlations. So we'll put everybody's ideas together here. Does all this make sense? Ring a bell. Understand why we're getting a response to selection when we select on one trait and then we observe a correlated response in another trait. Okay, so we're in this scenario, and what are we going to do about it? So we mentioned, well, when we first began our discussion of social behavior, that you can select on different levels. So you can select at the level of the individual, you can select on family groups. And then I said that there's this term out there, group selection, that's really dangerous. And that kind of leads to things like species selection. So let's talk about, we're going to bring up group selection again and talk about how this actually can be useful, even though its initial treatment is thought of as not being possible. So the initial treatment of group selection was coined by Wynne Edwards in a series of papers in the 1960s, and it really created a huge controversy or just total storm within the evolutionary biology community during this time. So Wynne Edwards wrote these series of papers to try and explain why animals or how animals actually exploit resources sustainably. So specifically, he proposed that most animal populations really don't overexploit their resources because groups that don't have higher fitness. So he argued that group selection can actually overcome this overexploiters by gaining an all group advantage and being able to reproduce faster than other groups. So let's just think about his argument. He's saying that if everybody limits themselves a little bit, that entire group can reproduce faster. And this is why we see animals actually exploiting resources sustainably in nature. So based on what we learned in this class, what does this expose us to? Why wouldn't this work? Why did everybody just absolutely hate this idea so much? What did we learn about when we played the prisoner's dilemma?
Isn't that animals are naturally selfish?
Yeah, they are naturally selfish. So if you have everybody cooperating and, limiting themselves, what if you have one individual in there who's not? So this individual is most certainly behaving selfishly, and we have another formal term for an individual who's not cooperating while everybody else is. Something you would have called maybe one of your friends when you were in elementary school.
A cheater?
Yep, a cheater. Yeah, that actually is a formal term in game theory that defines a strategy. If you can cheat others, you can do better. And we see this all the time in human populations. If we just think about, this was, I think 8 years ago now, the serious drought in California that is really ongoing and probably will never go away. So humans consuming water, and you have to put laws in order to get people to stop doing this. And this, this has a different treatment in economics. We call this the tragedy of the commons, but it's the same exact idea. So now in economic theory, that we have a situation where there's a shared resource, and getting people to not act in their own selfish interest is nearly impossible. So you literally have to put a law on how many times you can flush the toilet in order to get people to stop using all the water in California. And if people can take advantage of this in their own selfish interest, they will cheat the system. So this pattern comes up over and over and over again in nature and in human populations. So this group selection controversy was really a battle between John Maynard Smith and Wynne Edwards. And Maynard Smith just absolutely hated group selection. There was no way he was going to let this go. So he argued that natural selection primarily acts at the level of the individual, and it would be absolutely impossible ever for selection to favor individuals who sacrifice fitness for the sake of the group unless kin selection was possible. So when kin selection is operating, how do individuals get a fitness benefit here? They get an inclusive fitness benefit through the fitness of who?
Their relatives.
Their relatives, yes, exactly. Yeah, so kin selection, everybody was on board with that. They could see, they can actually calculate and tabulate the fitness benefit here, but a group of unrelated individuals, they said, no, absolutely not. This is not possible. You are exposing yourselves to cheaters unless there's some kind of reciprocal altruism or benefit over time that unrelated individuals can get. But just doing it, without any benefit, if it's possible to cheat, then this scenario will never evolve. But there's been a renewed interest in group selection, in particular with respect to agriculture. So part of that reason is you have a lot of control over who breeds and who doesn't. So it's actually been renamed. So instead of group selection, we call it now multi-level selection. And this is really more of a combination of individual, kin, and group level selection. So you use all three at the same time. And the idea is that the most altruistic groups within a population then enjoy the greatest reproductive success, and thereby also fuel the evolution of altruism within a population. What you can do in an agricultural system is you have very finite control over who breeds with who, so you can get group selection to work a lot better, and you can get it to work even if individuals are unrelated. It helps even more if they are related. So if you have kin, let's say in the same cage, that's even better, but it works just fine with unrelated individuals. So let's see why this is. So now that we, refreshed ourselves with cheaters and, explained some of the difficulties with group selection, why that would never work or is supposed to never work, and now we're saying it's going to work, let's see why. So first I need to give you some background on genotype by environment interactions, or what are called G by E's. And so G by E's, they most certainly do contribute to overall phenotypic variance. So if we remember, again, reviewing, the phenotypic variance is composed of genetic and environmental effects, and we can decompose those genetic effects into additive, epistatic, and dominance effects. So we're going to add this one in there too. This one also is important, and we can decompose the phenotype into these effects as well. So I'm going to use these axes I have drawn here already, and we're going to draw out what's called a reaction norm. So let's put the phenotype here on the y-axis. And the environment, let's say we have two environments, environment 1 and environment 2. So I'm going to give you a scenario in dairy cows to just explain how this works. And then we're going to bring this back eventually to these social problems in poultry. So if we want to use two different environments in which dairy cows live in, so we know that dairy cows are housed, or producers are widespread all over the US. And so let's call environment 1 a dairy in West Texas. So let's say this is somewhere in Texas. And let's say environment 2 is Western Washington. So what is something that you would notice would be very different about West Texas and Western Washington that would be very pertinent to a dairy cow?
Would it be the humidity?
Yeah, humidity, or what the humidity, I forget what it's called, humidity index, something about the heat humidity index. What is that actually called when you combine those two metrics?
The UV index? I don't know, actually.
Yeah, I can't remember. Does somebody else know? Temperature humidity index, that's what it is, right? I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Yeah, so let's go with Taylor's suggestion. So something to do with temperature and humidity. Does anybody have anything else to add? What do dairy cows think of very hot weather? I know there are people in dairy in this class. Dairy cows are a Nordic breed. Am I right? Is it hot in West Texas?
Doesn't excessive heat like reduce milk production and then also make breeding harder?
Yeah, they suffer a lot from heat stress. So it does affect their fertility, and it most certainly affects their production. So I'm going to, argue here for our little example's sake that it's quite a bit hotter in West Texas than it is in Western Washington. I mean, has anybody else been to these two places? Can you confirm that I'm telling you something true about the weather in each area?
Definitely.
Okay. I was like, Western Washington is not super hot in the summer, and I have been to West Texas in the summer, and it was quite hot. Okay, so the phenotype, let's just say milk production. So milk production in kilograms per day. So maybe in West Texas, we're going to call this genotype A. In West Texas, genotype A produces less milk than genotype B. And let's just say, for argument's sake, cows produce more in Western Washington because it's not as hot. So obviously there's going to be a huge system effect here, but let's just make things simple for right now. And genotype A is still going to produce some amount, but more than in Texas, and genotype B is still going to produce more than genotype A. And as We're going to say the environment. Imagine that it's somewhat continuous from Texas to Washington. So we're going to connect these with lines. And we're going to notice that they're parallel. Okay, there's an environmental effect. There's the environment in Texas and the environment in Washington. And it doesn't matter which genotype we're talking about here, the environment produces a different effect on the phenotype. So now let's come over here and make these same arguments. So again, environment 1 is going to be West Texas and environment 2 is going to be Western Washington. And we're still going to say this is milk production per day in kilograms. And, but let's say this is a different locus and we're looking at different genes. So, you know, these genes A and B, these confer some kind of benefit or substitution effect on milk production itself. And let's say we're going to look at locus or loci C, we're just going to call them arbitrarily C and D. And these confer some kind of heat resistance or heat stress tolerance to the cow. So maybe in West Texas, having genotype C gives you some average phenotypic value, but actually genotype D produces or confers this heat resistance and allows cows, if they're more heat resistant, they actually produce more milk. But environment 2, this is Western Washington, there's some cost to this. So if it's not really that hot, actually individuals that are have genotype C produce a lot more milk than individuals with this other genotype. So I'm just labeling them arbitrary. So D just is an arbitrary label for a type of a specific genotype that of course would be diallylic. So, you know, it would be CG or something like that. And again, this is over continuous space. I'll draw as straight a line as I possibly can. And if we connect these two, what we see is the reaction norm lines actually cross. And this is what we would call a genotype by environment interaction, where depending on what environment this genotype is actually in, it produces a different effect on the phenotype. So that is what I mean by genotype by environment interaction, and why these things are important if we want to decompose phenotypic variants. Any questions? Okay, so let's introduce another new concept, indirect genetic effects. So an indirect genetic effect is the environmental influences of a phenotype from one individual that are due to the expression of genes in a different individual. So let's go through another arbitrary example just to explain this concept and think about a mother-offspring pair. So the phenotype we're interested in, denoted here as Z, is offspring size. So we have some offspring phenotypic value and we're going to measure their size. So what things contribute to, and let's say this offspring is a mammal, what things contribute to offspring size in mammals?
Be feed intake.
Yeah. So let's put a big arrow here and just say food. Yeah, absolutely, food. What else?
Would their environment affect it?
Yeah. Environment probably would too. Something like how stressed you are. We'll put environment for a catch-all. And food really is an environmental effect as well, but a very, very important one if we're talking about size. What's the last obvious one here?
Genetics.
Yeah, genetics. So we're going to put genetics down here. So this is the offspring's own genes. So offspring genetics definitely contribute to their size. So now let's add some genetic effects kind of above this tier, and this is what are going to be called the indirect genetic effects. So let's sum up these two things that we came up with, food and the environment, and say that these two things, they most certainly influence offspring size. And let's say that these come from nurturing, their mother's nurturing behavior. So how much their mother is able to deal with the environment and feed them, right? So in a mammal, a lot of your food, especially when you're young, is coming directly from your mother. And here, there's even something above this, which are maternal genes. You can definitely have maternal genes that influence nurturing behavior. So this is what I mean by an indirect genetic effect, is that these genes can, through this pathway, trickle down and eventually influence this behavior offspring size. So this is the classic example of an indirect genetic effect. Does this make sense why these genes indirectly affect this offspring? So we'll use this as a simple example. Okay, so these effects, they're more universal than just mother-offspring pairs. We're just using this to exemplify what they actually are and understand the definition. So let's put some of this stuff together now. And so in our earlier slide, if we want to know something about G by E, so genotype by environment interactions, and we know that these are really important to phenotypic variation, we know that we can now start adding in indirect genetic effects. Well, what if the environment has a genotype? So what if something like indirect genetic effects from aggressive interactions are actually present in something like this very ultra close society that you would be living in if you were a laying hen in a battery cage? So let's draw this out now as well. So instead of an environment now, we're talking about individuals interacting with each other. And so the social environment literally does have a genotype. So let's put genotypes here on the x-axis. So let's say genotype A for aggressive individuals, and genotype S maybe for more subordinate individuals. And our phenotype, let's say eggs per day. Per individual. Let's stay in the land of individuals right now. So here, maybe we have this kind of scenario where if a subordinate individual is interacting with an aggressive individual, maybe they don't lay very many eggs per day. And if an aggressive individual acts with another aggressive individual, maybe they lay a little bit more than a subordinate. But as we've seen, these interactions, they can be quite violent and stressful. So maybe being hyper-aggressive, no matter who you're interacting with is not the best. But if you're able to, hold your own a little bit more, maybe you do a little bit better. But over here, let's say now we're interacting with these more altruistic or more subordinate individuals. And if we get two subordinate individuals interacting with each other, maybe they lay quite a few more eggs per day. But if you get another aggressive individual interacting with a subordinate individual, then actually that's a little bit lower. Not much, but it's this equivalent to this dot right here. So if this is occurring over a continuous phenotypic space, you might get a reaction norm looking something like this. And again, these lines are crossing, so we know that there's an interaction occurring. So now what we can gather from this, and this has actually been tested, is instead of just doing this, this drawing depicts an interaction between two individuals, but within a battery cage, you can have 3 to 8 individuals interacting. It's really hard to do this pairwise, but you can actually just, go around throughout your production system and figure out which groups are producing more eggs. So it's really easy to label something like a battery cage, 1 through however many you have, and see who's doing the best. And then you could pick those groups to be the breeders of the next generation. So again, to reiterate, and we'll finish this up here in just a minute. So the problem is that social interactions decrease welfare and decrease production. And a possible solution is that if you use groups as the unit of selection instead of the individual, these traits are in fact heritable because of the genetic effects that are manifested through these IGEs. And the result is you increase overall production and you increase welfare. So this is the last slide, and this is from a study that actually invoked multi-level selection, and their results were exactly that. So in fact, the annual percentage of mortality of these selected lines in these multi-bird cages decreased from 68% in generation 2 to 8.8% in generation 6. And that is equivalent to the same mortality rate as one bird living in a battery cage all by itself. The most important thing from this is this suggests that it can eliminate the need to beak trim. So it doesn't get rid of all these other welfare concerns. It doesn't get rid of, the lack of space. Those are still going to be present. It's just that if it can alleviate at least one thing, you're doing better. So if you alleviate the need to beak trim, you're not putting them through acute pain. And then there was a benefit to the producers as well in that production actually increased for all of these things. So we'll end there. We're over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Yep, I'll see everybody on Wednesday.
Dr. Clancy?
Yeah.
I was just curious if this is our last quiz, if it's going to be comprehensive over all of the stuff that we've learned, or if it's just the recent stuff that we learned.
So it'll be just like quiz 3, you kind of have to, for example, this lecture, you have to know about the concepts we learned at the genetics lecture to understand this lecture. So if I ask you about something from this lecture, you might need the genetics lecture to answer. So I'm primarily going to focus on the new lecture material, but everything is inherently cumulative.
Okay. And then I was looking on the syllabus and I just wasn't sure. Is there directly a final for this class? There isn't. Okay. It wasn't clear, and so I was just unsure.
Yeah. No, that's just when your essays due.
Okay. That's what I assumed, but I didn't want to assume wrong.
No, you're correct.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I actually wanted to ask if the essay will kind of work the same as the last one, where we like submit it twice, or is it just like the first submission because it's a final?
It's just the first submission because it's a final.
Once we get our like results from our once we get our results from our second submission, would we be able to like talk to you and see like how we could improve even more for the next
Yeah,
one?
sure. Yeah, I should have those done pretty soon. So, Raylan, actually, you, if I'm remembering correctly, you made a huge amount of improvement. So I'm pretty sure you're going to be pretty happy.
Okay, thank you. I was just
Yeah.
kind of nervous because it's just like a different writing style, so I was nervous
Yeah.
that I wasn't like doing it right. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's why I have you revise one and try and give more feedback. And what I found, like I know that nobody appreciates having their writing harshly graded, but what I found is when I do that, students make so much improvement on their next draft and then their next essay that
It definitely helped me to like kind of like visualize more of your like expectations, I guess.
yeah.
So
Yeah, so I wouldn't worry about it as far as your grade. You definitely, I do think I did yours not too long ago, and I do remember thinking that you made huge improvements. So
okay, thank you so much.
yeah,